Traditionally, China's best accomplishments came from copying the West. What if this is true not just in terms of technology, but it's also true in terms of ideology? After all, Marxism, the bedrock of the Chinese Communist Party, is also Western. But what if this is true about woke stuff as well? What if it is true also about the most successful economic policy in China, that is to say, those special economic zones? What if that is also a Western idea? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Propaganda Basement. I suppose this is the 7th episode in this season. As customary, China Daily. This time we'll be reading the July 7 to 13th 2023 edition. And in this one we're gonna see a lot of stuff that well, as I was reading it, I was reading them, thinking which ones I should introduce into the show and which ones I shouldn't. There was a lot of deja vu, that is to say, I have seen this movie before. Like, for instance, this one. Export curbs not aimed at anyone. Officials and experts cite national interest, security concerns for restrictions on semiconductor minerals. So there you go. When the United States does these kinds of things, it is an unfriendly gesture from the United States. When China does exactly the same, all the export curbs are actually not aimed at anyone. There you go. Look, the experts cite things. So, it was just a purely technocratic decision, nothing to do with geopolitics, nothing to see here. Move along, citizen. Very convenient, of course. There you go. Dutch ban on chips may hit supply chain. So, when the Netherlands does exactly the same, then it's, of course, a huge issue and it gets a huge article that, oh my goodness, the line doesn't go up anymore, therefore it's a big problem. But when China does it, of course, there's not an issue at all. Making a big difference. Cambodia's Special Economic Zone highlights China's Belt and Road Initiative role in boosting industries and people's lives. An article by Lin Shuyan in Sihanoukville, Cambodia. Joint venture between Chinese and Cambodian enterprises launched 15 years ago has had a profound impact on the Cambodian economy and local people's lives. I should probably enchant you with footage from Cambodia while discussing this rather than showing you the newspaper. Anyway, to many people in Cambodia, the Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone is somewhat surreal, as the area in which it is located used to be nothing more than a vast wilderness. Now, the 1113 square kilometer zone located in the Sihanoukville's Pei Nop district is Cambodia's largest industrial park and home to 175 enterprises from around the world. Jointly developed by private companies from Cambodia and China, the zone is considered a landmark Belt and Road Initiative collaboration project between the two nations. So here we have an example of retroactively making something as part of a more recent initiative. 15 years ago, the idea of BRI was just a theory, and this particular deal with the Sihanoukville port, because that's really all there is to it, was not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But because it became somewhat functional, terms and conditions may apply, then suddenly it's good enough to say, oh, look, this is another accomplishment by the Belt and Road Initiative, when in fact it really wasn't. To the extent that the Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone is a success, EU can credit some of the Chinese contractors, although the Chinese participation these days is minority there. But it's not a success of the Belt and Road Initiative in and of itself. Now, the reason why I'm saying that terms and conditions may apply is because the current Cambodian regime tries to get as many enterprises and entities as possible involved there because, well, the initial plan that they followed, which was given to them by China, turned out to be economically unfeasible, and in fact it was generating a loss. So multiple other entities from both the West and Russia picked up the tab and at least made sure that the whole thing doesn't do an economic collapse over there. Although that has also drawn a lot of problems to Cambodia. Like when I was there, a Russian vessel docked there and created quite a bit of a hula baloo as a result of it. So it's a little bit more complicated, but of course you will not read that about that in China Daily because, well, that would be a stain on the whole project. Meanwhile, China-Africa trade hits 260 billion. Officials from both sides share positive outlook as customs index show rapid growth since 2000. It's very interesting, and we will see again in this newspaper a little bit later. All of these relatively minuscule numbers are touted as some serious accomplishments. And considering that this is a propaganda newspaper, I will dare to do the not exactly journalistically accurate, but generally speaking quite accurate assumption that this is even an exaggeration. The true number may even be lower than that. But let's for a second assume that this is a correct number. $260 billion at the size of the economy of China and at the size of the combined economies of African countries is really no big deal. I mean, when the al-Gaddafi Italy deal was still in force, when of course al-Gaddafi was still alive, meant sending oil worth a little bit more than that to Italy in a trimester, in 3 months. And that was 13, 14 years ago, when $260 billion was actually worth more than today. So, and that was just with a single country, Libya, towards another single country, Italy, right? Italy, not exactly the wealthiest nation in Europe. So, looking from that perspective, this accomplishment touted with a huge title, a huge headline by this newspaper tells me that the encroachment by China in Africa is actually not going according to the plan. So there's that. Trade between China and Africa grew to 1.88 trillion yuan in 2022 from less than 100 billion yuan in 2000. Data from China's General Administration of Customs showed. The China-Africa Trade Index, released for the first time, had a base of 100 points in 2000, which reached 990.55 points in 2022, with a rapid and positive development trend and scaled new heights. The index details were disclosed during the third China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo in Changsha, capital city of Hunan province, on June the 29th. Chinese Vice President said China firmly supports Africa in pursuing an independent and autonomous development path. Yeah, sure, of course, because, translation from Chinese, the independent and autonomous development path, that is to say, an economic path that is highly dependent on China and highly dependent on doing the CCP's geopolitical bidding. That's basically what this means. But again, this would be acceptable if the size, acceptable from an African standpoint, if the size of the trade would actually be significant. $260 billion is really not significant, no matter how much this newspaper tries to convince you otherwise. Belt and Road Initiative spurs high-level cooperation. Initiative helps Beijing, Moscow build bridges to create shared future and mutual growth. So yeah, basically the CCP is trying to integrate the Power of Siberia project into the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, this article doesn't say, but one of the problems of doing that would be that Gazprom would have to cede some sovereignty in the Far East, which of course Russia is not willing to do. But from the Chinese perspective, well, of course you will do this because you're broke. Almost 2 years have passed since this, and the Chinese colonization in the Far East is going according to the plan, not according to the Russian plan. And the more this drags on, the more the Chinese elites are gearing up to bleeding Russia dry of resources. This can be so much fun to watch. Maybe this year in 25 we should try to find more editions of China Daily to see how this is being described as it's happening. Farming beefs up Sino-Russian ties. Countries strengthen cooperation in key growth sector for bilateral trade. This is basically what I've been saying in previous episodes, namely that China is not self-sufficient when it comes to food, and it needs imports from both Russia and Ukraine. And it's one of the reasons why China is so interested in having a say in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Now, here's the standard talking point. Dollar's dominance eroding fast. US units hegemony is crumbling amid rise of a new multi-currency economic order. There's just one problem. There's this graph. Does it look like dollar's dominance is eroding fast to you? Especially once you add up the pound sterling and the euro, which are also US aligned. If anything, we could make a case that renminbi is hitting a ceiling, and it shouldn't. I mean, given the size of China's economy, the yuan should be stronger on this graph just by natural growth alone, and yet that doesn't happen. So I don't know about that eroding fast, but it just doesn't work. A very important development is taking place, which will deal a blow to those who have pinned their hopes on the US. The establishment of a fairer world is gradually becoming a reality as a wave of rebellion is rising against the 8-decade reign of the US dollar in global trade. I'm sorry, the US dollar hasn't been reigning for that long. It's a little bit shorter than that. But then again, it makes for better propaganda to say that you're struggling against an 8-decade dominance. And then there's this. Growth miracle changes global fortunes. US-led West has to accept a multipolar world future driven by Chinese initiatives. I love this headline because this one at least is not beating around the bush. So, on one hand, the multipolar world, but then, with China at its center. So, globalism, but in ideograms. That's basically the alternative proposed to you by the CCP. But then it gets into the nitty-gritty of it, and it's quite astonishing. This tells me that the CCP shills in the West really don't read the fine print, because if they had, they would stop promoting this nonsense. Here we go. It's written by Dan Steinbock, founder of Difference Group, who has served at the India, China and America Institute, at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, and the EU Center in Singapore. So, basically top-tier Chinese shill, this author. Starting from the late 70s, when the reform and the opening up policy was launched, the Communist Party of China has focused on the decollectivization of agriculture, opening up the country to foreign investment and advanced technology, and encouraging entrepreneurship. With nationwide industrial takeoff, economic reforms broadened while price controls, protectionist policies, and regulations were lifted. Nothing exemplifies the success of China's reform and opening up better than Shenzhen. In 1979, it was a poor fishing village with some 20,000 residents struggling at the subsistence level. Today, it has an urban population of almost 18 million, and its per capita GDP nominal is more than $27,000, on par with Portugal and Bahrain. In this process, a special catalyst role was played by the special economic zones, which were initiated in coastal China. So let me get this straight. This whole dirigism applied by the CCP to the Chinese economy managed from 1979, so that's 46 years ago, managed in 46 years to get to a GDP per capita nominal slightly bigger than Portugal, that is to say the poorest country, or the second poorest country in the European Union, the poorest being Bulgaria, in 46 years. Really? Well, if that is the standard, then we can immediately conclude that China would have been better off by doing what Eastern Europe did, which managed an even bigger performance than this one in 35 years rather than 45 years, and all without this highly wise dirigism from a centralized economy. In fact, Eastern Europe managed this by explicitly rejecting central planning. In 2018, economic development in Guangdong province moved to a new stage with the launch of the Greater Bay Area. Initially, like Western Europe and Japan in the post-war era, Chinese companies used to imitate global technology leaders. Today, Chinese innovators and high-tech companies such as Huawei and ByteDance are being imitated by global competitors and cooperators. Hence, U.S. efforts to contain Chinese innovators in the name of national security. When reform and opening up were launched in the 1970s, the standard Western reform packages were shaped by the Washington Consensus, which promoted disruptive liberalization, deregulation, and privatization across the board. Such reforms primarily benefited foreign investors, domestic oligarchs, and the informal economy, not the ordinary people. I'm sorry, the informal economy is ordinary people. And of course, the author knows this, but that's a separate story. This was not the Chinese path, which favors stability, gradual advances, and pragmatic experimentation. While the CPC leadership with former President Jiang Zemin, its core further developed socialism with Chinese characteristic through his theory of three represents. It also launched in 1990s a campaign against corruption. Anyway, so this is a laudatio of the CCP's economic policies in the last 45 years or so. But then again, if these numbers are correct, and again, I do have my suspicions that they're not, that is to say that it's overstating its case, but for the sake of the argument, let's assume this is correct. So from 1979 and until, 2023, when this article was published, so in 44 years, they managed a slightly poorer performance than, pretty much everyone in Eastern Europe except Bulgaria, I guess. That's not a good enough laudatio. That's my opinion about it. If this is true, then we can safely say, again, based on the reporting, quote unquote, by the CCP's official newspaper, that the CCP's economic policies are shit. Anyway, so yeah, this is what I wanted to show to you. The US-led West has to accept a multipolar world future driven by Chinese initiatives. And again, their best example is, effectively TikTok. I don't think and Huawei. Huawei, which in fact still does imitate Western companies, and TikTok's innovation is a much faster and slightly more effective way of spreading brain rot. I would probably not classify that as successful innovation. I'm sorry. But still, I guess that's one innovation in propaganda. Too bad that that particular innovation in the end doesn't effectively spread Chinese propaganda, but I guess we'll have time to learn about that as well. And then there's this article, which is a good segue into the next episode. Chinese students are shunning the US. Anti-Asian racism, safety fears, and better opportunities nearer home amid reasons for death of the American dream. Okay, says Zhang Minlu in New York. He Jing, a sophomore student, was sitting in a campus hallway at Zhejiang University of Finance and Economics in Hangzhou, capital of Zhejiang province, on November the 9th, 2021, when she learned that a 24-year-old Chinese graduate student at the University of Chicago had been fatally shot. Studying English for her upcoming graduate record examination, a standard requirement for entry to graduate school in the US, he said she was deeply shocked by the death of Zheng Xiaoqiong, who was killed during a robbery near his university campus. Zheng was studying statistics in Chicago, which was also his field at the time. I was so sorry to hear about his death, who who later became one of the many Chinese international students who changed their plans to study in the US. Last year, some 290,000 Chinese students were studying in the US, an 8.6% decline from the previous year, data from the International Education Institute for International Education show. Now, you will notice that they use numbers from 2020 and 2021, which is a time when China was effectively barring a lot of its citizens from leaving the country, or they would let them leave the country but make it very difficult for them to return under the excuse of the so-called pandemic. But of course, if we mention that, then it suddenly becomes a little bit more problematic because, well, then you can't talk about a student being fatally shot. But you will notice this: anti-Asian racism and safety fears. If there is one institutionally racist society, at least in the semi-developed ones on this planet, then China would have to make the top 3 at the very least. I am serious. Just look it up. It's a very widely documented phenomenon. China is a very racist society. Very, very racist society. It's almost cartoonishly racist at some points, in a way that no Western society really is. And that's not to say that there isn't racism in the West. Yes, there is, of course, but not the way it exists in China, and it definitely doesn't manifest the way it manifests in China. And this whole anti-Asian racism is a concoction mostly of the far left, and you will notice that in the previous decade, you would not see these kinds of things. You would not see concerns about anti-Asian racism. This was confined to small chat rooms, and mostly Japanese students would talk about this. But other than that, you would not see this seriously quoted even in a semi-serious newspaper like this one. But now it's suddenly a concern. And the reason for that is because the CCP has to find a way to frame this internally back at home. Because the number of Chinese students in the US has been dropping, true, but the main reason for that is not anti-Asian racism or concerns for safety. The main reason for that is because finally the Americans have figured it out that the CCP has been sending spies into their country. And they started being a little bit more rigorous in screening those out. And guess what? Once you start looking for it, you'll start finding it. But of course, the CCP cannot openly admit that the reason we send fewer students over there is because, well, we've been sending too many spies and you started catching up with it. So they'll have to find a way to explain that. So yeah, that's basically how this works. In the next episode, I'll show it to you because the China Daily even wrote about that eventually. But the reason I set this pile not chronologically ordered is precisely because I want to show how even when they do write something true, they write the opposite of it just 1 or 2 or 3 weeks later, because they rely on the fact that nobody takes a huge pile of China Daily and start to compare notes. The point of this paper is, again, not just to persuade, but to plant narratives, to plant stories. And most people who get exposed to China Daily, they rarely get exposed to 2 newspapers or 3 newspapers, let alone 15 or 20, like I did. Because, well, if you're exposed to 15 or 20, then you start comparing notes and you start to notice some patterns over there. So yeah, in the next episode, I'll show it to you that even China Daily talks about spies. But until then, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. If you like this kind of content, please consider supporting us with a donation. And I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative. Cheers.